Ahora continuaremos con el primero
We will
de los
continue
trabajos
with
que
the
vamos a estar
next set
presentando
of
entre lo que es el
works
de hoy y de
that have
mañana, que
been
se han realizado
carried
en el
out.
contexto de la red APP,
And we will
el
talk
modelo económico
about
financiero para estructurar
revolving
fondos revolventes con
with
activos
works that have been
reciclados y el rol de las
done
tarifas
with
pagadas por los
revolving
usuarios.
funds. And I
Le
would like
paso la
to
palabra a
give the
mi
floor
colega del
to
equipo APP,
Daniel
especialista
Gates, who
senior
is
de
our
operaciones,
specialist
Daniel
on
Vieites, para que introduzca el
funds.
trabajo y el
Daniel,
panel.
please.
Daniel, para ti.
Muchas gracias, Ancor. ¿Se me escucha?
Thank you, Ancor.
Sí, perfecto.
Can you
Adelante,
hear
Daniel.
me?
Te agradezco mucho, Ancor. Pues bienvenidos y bienvenidas. Les recuerdo que está disponible la interpretación
Well,
simultánea
I
en español,
remind you
inglés
that
y
we
portugués
have
también.
interpretation in
Soy Daniel
English, Spanish,
Vieites,
and Portuguese. I
especialista
am
senior de
Daniel
operaciones
Gates,
del
and I am
equipo
the
APP
senior
del BID, liderado por
specialist
Gastón
of the
Astesiano, y soy el
PPP
moderador de
team,
esta
and I am the
sesión.
moderator of
En
this
esta
session.
sesión del
This
Congreso APP,
session
Innovación y APP, Nuevos Instrumentos
on
en el Congreso
innovation
y
and
Lanzamiento,
PPPs,
contaremos con la
new
presentación del
instruments,
estudio
and
Modelo
funding and
Económico y Financiero
financing.
para estructurar
We
fondos
will
revolventes
have
con
a
activos reciclados,
presentation on
valores
the
residuales y el rol
economic
de las
model
tarifas pagadas
for
por los usuarios,
recycled assets
elaborado
and
por la
residual
llamada de
values, and the
propuestas en el
role
ciclo
of
2021
the
de la red
fees paid
APP.
by users.
Después de la presentación se seguirá
And
una
after the
discusión sobre el tema
presentation,
con
there
un
will
panel de
be a
invitados.
discussion
Nos
with
compartirán su
a
experiencia en el
panel
sector de
that
APPs en
will
América
share their
Latina y el Caribe.
experiences with us
La
in Latin
semblanza
America and the
profesional de los
Caribbean.
presentadores y los panelistas es
And
la siguiente. Anlock Master
Anne
Alemán es doctor en economía de la French
Master
School of
Aleman,
Economics,
he's a
Francia,
doctor
y
on
cuenta con
economics,
más de 20
and
años de
he has more
experiencia
than 20 years
profesional
of
con amplio
experience.
conocimiento en evaluación
And
socioeconómica de proyectos de inversión,
she has
identificación
an
y evaluación
experience
y
in
selección de proyectos
identifying
APP
and
y
selecting a
diseño y
PP projects
fortalecimiento del
and
sistema de inversión
designing
pública.
and strengthening
Actualmente es directora
public
ejecutiva del
projects.
IPAPEM
And
Institute.
she is the
Es un
director,
instituto de
the
capacitación y
CEO of
estudios
the PPP
especializados en
Institute,
infraestructura
who
pública y
that
privada.
specializes in
Sergio
public and
Alejandro
private
Hinojosa es licenciado en
projects.
Economía y doctor
And
en
Sergio
Management
Alejandro
Sciences con
Hinojosa is an
especialidad en
economist,
Economía Financiera por
and
el
he
Salle
has a
Business School.
specialty
Posee
in
amplia experiencia en
financial
asuntos
economics,
relacionados
and
a
he has
financiamiento de
broad
proyectos
experience
APP,
in
modelos de gestión de activos
PPP
públicos,
projects, in public
metodologías de evaluación de
asset
proyectos de
management, in
infraestructura y
methodologies
estructuración de
for the
APP bajo Project
evaluation of
Finance. Tiene más de
PPP
35 años de
projects,
experiencia
and he has more than
profesional
35
y ha
years of
prestado asesoría en
professional
más de 30 países.
experience, and
Es
he
socio
has
fundador de
been
ICONS
an advisor to
Academia y
more than
asesor
30
principal de PP.
countries, and he is a
Pasando
main
a los panelistas, Federico Villalobos
advisor. So
tiene más de 15
Federico
años de experiencia en modelos
Villalobos
financieros
has more than
avanzados, Project
15
Finance,
years of
evaluación
experience
financiera y
in
económica de proyectos,
advanced
así
projects
como en
and
capacitación
in
pública-privada.
assessing
Graduado en
PPP
Economía por la
projects.
Universidad
He
de Costa Rica
is
con
an
una
economist
maestría
from
en
the
Administración
University
de
of
Empresas
Costa
en la
Rica and
Escuela
holds a
de
master's
Organización Industrial
in
de España. Es socio de infraestructura y
in
proyectos de
economics
capital para Centroamérica y República Dominicana en Deloitte.
Spain, and
Carlos
he
Mieri
works
Terán
in
es
Dominican
director general
Republic
adjunto de
projects as
Banca de
well. Carlos
Inversión en
Mieriterán
Banorras
is
y director del Fondo
an
Nacional de Infraestructura
deputy
Fonadín.
director of
Graduado con
the
mención honorífica como ingeniero civil por la
Fonadin
Universidad
in
Nacional de
Banobras
Economía
in
de la UNIF,
Mexico, and
UNAM,
he
con posgrado
is
en Planeación
an
Económica de la
engineer
UNAM y
from the
maestría en
Mexican
Investigación de Operaciones
Autonomous
por la Langdon
University.
School of Economics.
He has also a
Asimismo, cuenta
master's
con
from the
más de
Langdon
20
School
años
of
de experiencia
Economics
en
and has
diversos
more than
sectores
20
como
years of
transporte,
experience
puertos y
in different
telecomunicaciones.
sectors like
Finalmente, Rafael
communications, ports,
Magallanes
and
Furtado
airports. And
es
Rafael
secretario de Desarrollo de Planeación y
Magallanes is
Asociaciones del Ministerio de Infraestructura de
also
Brasil, graduado en Derecho por la Universidad
works for the Ministry
Fortaleza
of
con maestría en
Infrastructure in
Logística y
Brazil.
Gestión
He
Portuaria por la
graduated from the
Universidad
University of
Politécnica Balones.
Fortaleza,
Es miembro
and
suplente del
he
Consejo
is
Director del Fondo
a
de Marina
the
Mercante
deputy
y
member
miembro del
of
Consejo de
Marina
Administración de la
Mercante and a
Compañía de
member
Muelles de
of
Río de
the
Janeiro. A manera de
Port
introducción, quiero
Administration in Rio
mencionarles
de
que el
Janeiro.
estudio
I would
elaborado
like
por el
to
PPPM
tell you that the
Institute
study
y que será
prepared
presentada
by
por
the
Anlao y Sergio
PPM
es de gran relevancia,
Institute that will
ya que
be
sabiendo que las principales
presented by
fuentes
Anne
de
Laure
fondeo que
and Sergio,
tradicionalmente existen para
it
cubrir los
means
costos de
that
construcción, operación
there
y
are
mantenimiento
is
de los
important
servicios
because there are large
de
costs
infraestructura
involved
son las
in
tarifas
maintaining
que pagan los
infrastructure
usuarios
costs.
y los
The
pagos por
fees
disponibilidad
show
y uso
that,
de la
and
infraestructura, provenientes
they
estos
pay
de los impuestos o de la deuda que
for
paga la sociedad.
infrastructure, and
Actualmente están consolidándose
they
y
are
emergiendo en la
now
región dos nuevas
in
fuentes de
the new
fondeo
region, we find two sources of funding, which are recycled assets and residual value that will help ameliorate the costs of PPP projects throughout the life of the infrastructure. This study also emphasizes that in order for these mechanisms to work correctly, it is important that the projects have a fee scheme and a fee policy that will not be too high on the users. The question is whether the fee will cover beyond the marginal cost of the project and whether the fee should be applicable for a long project. So can we capitalize on revolving funds for infrastructure? So both the two countries that have applied recycled assets in the region are Mexico and Chile, and Australia has done it, not in the region. But there is a huge potential for these projects, and in Mexico, these projects allowed for the creation of Fonadina, and in Chile, the infrastructure project, and this allowed recycling assets and using residual value as a source of financing. So now we will hear the presentation called a financial and economic model for the restructuring of revolving assets with recycled assets and residual values, and the role of the fees paid by users. Anne-Laure and Sergio, please. Well, I'm sharing my screen now.
Sí, correcto.
Hola, sí, perfecto, muy bien. Muchas gracias a todos, ¿no? Buenos días, muchas gracias a la red APP, ¿no?
And thanks to APP and to the IDB.
De hecho, a mí me toca presentar, pero es un trabajo que hicimos en equipo y el líder del equipo es justamente Sergio Hinojosa. I
have worked with Sergio Hinojosa in this project, but we also had Roberto Muñoz as the economist who helped us with all the theory, and we had Enrique Moraga, and we have Patricio Mancilla who helped us with all the planning.
Es un trabajo bastante, de hecho, extenso, ¿no? En alcance, ¿no? Y claramente no voy a poder presentar todo hoy, ¿no? Entonces seleccioné algunos temas, ¿no? El primero de los objetivos fue proponer una tipología de esquemas de valorización de activos.
The first thing that we did was define the scope of our study. The first thing was to define a typology of to appraise the assets, which means recycling the assets and assessing the residual value of the assets. Then we submitted the case study of the thoroughfare concessions in Chile that combines the asset recycling and the use of residual value. We also wanted to share a model of overlapped generations that rather than imposing a fee beyond this the funding of a project, we thought about imposing or issuing a fee that will foster growth and that will create intergenerational fairness. And on the other hand, this would be useful for governments because they would be able to support the governments to structure assets and residual value, and these would be applicable to the different types of schemes.
Entonces, básicamente, hay un debate, ¿no?
And today there is a debate, and
no, en particular los peajes que vale para otras infraestructuras no se tienen que seguir pagando hasta la eternidad, ¿no? Porque
some infrastructures, the dilemma was whether there should be fees applicable throughout the project or beyond the completion of a project. The question is why would the question of the society is why would they continue to pay a fee for that? But then we should revert that question. When we say, well, then why would only one generation be responsible for the cost of the infrastructure that in the end will be enjoyed by many generations, because the useful life of the project is longer than the initial period of concession or the original period of funding. So one of the key aspects of our project was to ask ourselves what would be the logic of just establishing a fee beyond the period of financing, and how to use those fees to recycle the assets. There is a rationale of intergenerational fairness, because future generations will be using that infrastructure as well. So in a way, they must be responsible as well, or must be involved to finance this infrastructure or other infrastructure as well. So let's say if we are speaking about a highway, and if the highway was given to under a concession, well, the concession contemplated that fees would be imposed to pay for the project. So at the end of the concession, an option is to drop the toll to pay for operation and maintenance only, and not more than that. And the logic is the financial redemption of the project, because the economic value of a project is there. It continues to provide the service, but the financial value of the project is lost. So the people are willing to pay for that asset. So why couldn't we continue and maintain the tolls that were paid over time, and the second generation is overall richer than or has a higher income than the first generation, and then any surplus on the cost of operation and maintenance can be capitalized, and then the government can receive payment from existing infrastructure, and then use those funds to recycle assets. Reusing those resources is important. Those resources should be applied to an infrastructure fund to finance new infrastructure. So clearly, if there are new infrastructure needs, like expanding highway, for example, then the funds that are now in the fund that was created from the existing infrastructure could be used, and and it will cost less to the budget. So the idea is to identify what are the assets that can be used for recycling purposes. And we can see that there are different modes to apply the concept of recycling to different assets. And then after we define how are we going to recycle the asset, then we can apply the funds. So what is asset recycling? Asset recycling goes first through PPP contracts necessarily.
públicos que
or
han sido
they could
subutilizados, ¿no?
be
A optimizar,
underused
¿no? su
public
uso, ¿no?
assets as well.
O también
And
de
their
temas
assets,
de activos que no han
these
sido
are assets that need
tarificados,
to
¿no?
be
Que es también un
optimized,
esquema de
or
reciclaje que voy a hablar al ratito.
the
Para poder
or tolls or
obtener
fees could
usos
be
que
applied
después,
to
¿no? Y
assets
esto
that
es
have
importante,
that
se
have
van a
never paid
reinvertir,
a fee
¿no? Para
before.
apoyar,
The purpose
¿no?
is
Al
that any
funding de
funds that
nuevos
are
proyectos de infraestructura,
obtained
¿no?
from
Entonces, aquí
these
ven la
recycling of
figura,
assets are
¿no? La
reinvested
idea es
in
realmente
other
que vieja infraestructura
projects.
financie nueva
So
infraestructura. Entonces, que
the idea
activos
is that old
existentes,
assets
¿no?
will
Se
finance
vayan
new
concesionando,
assets. Existing
obteniendo
assets
recursos, ¿no? Que se vayan
can
a
be
alimentar un fondo de infraestructura que de nuevo
concessioned,
permita,
and
¿no? el
then
apoyar
the
al funding
fees
de otros
can be
proyectos, ¿no? Que
used
sean, de hecho, podría ser por obra
in the
pública tradicional,
development
pero
of
la
other
lógica es que
projects,
también sea por
whether
APP,
they are
para que de nuevo, ¿no? Se
traditional
pueda como hacer
public
ese
works or
círculo virtuoso,
through
¿no?
other
De hecho, si lo
PPPs
pensamos, ¿no?
to
El
create
caso
a
del
virtuous
Fonadín, ¿no?
cycle.
Que seguramente Carlos
Let's
más
think of
al rato
Fonadin.
va a hablar mucho más
Carlos
en
will
detalle, ¿no?
talk to us about
Justamente lo que
Fonadin
intentan
more in
hacer
detail.
es,
And what they
¿no?
try to
dirigir
do
los
there is
recursos, ¿no?
to
de los pagos de las tarifas de
use
las carreteras, ¿no? A
the
proyectos
resources
que en general son
in
rentables socialmente,
projects
pero
that
no
are
necesariamente privadamente, ¿no? Y
profitable
que requieren un apoyo
and that
adicional, ¿no?
need
del gobierno, ¿no?
additional
Que
support
sea
from the
transporte
government.
público, gestión integral de residuos sólidos,
Maybe
¿no? O
public
gestión sustentable
transportation
del agua,
or
¿no?
the
Entonces
management
están en
of,
esa
of
lógica,
waste
¿no? En ese
or
sentido de
water and
reciclaje
sewage and
de
sanitation.
activos, ¿no?
So that is the logic of asset
Entonces, el
recycling.
potencial, de hecho, al principio no se
Uh,
piensa, y
at
de
the
hecho no es
beginning,
el caso, ¿no? Que es mayor el potencial
what
en
one
países,
thinks
¿no? Que
that
tienen ya programas de
the
APPs
potential is
maduros,
higher
¿no? Que
in
ya han
countries
hecho
with
varios
that
proyectos,
are
¿no? Por concesión o APP.
PPP
De hecho,
mature
ya hay
or that have run
estimaciones, ¿no? De cuánto
several
se
PPP
podrían, ¿no?
projects. In fact, there are some estimates
De una
of
manera, cuál podrían ser los aportes, ¿no? A algunos fondos de
what could
inversión. En el
be
caso
the
de Chile, en
contributions
el año
of
2017, ¿no?
these
Se estimó un
of
aporte al fondo de
recycling
inversión de 9.000, ¿no? millones de
of assets.
dólares.
In Chile,
Y
it
más
was estimated
recientemente
that
también, ¿no? Se hicieron algunas
the
evaluaciones
contribution
para
to
Colombia
funds
y
could
Perú,
be of $9
donde
billion,
se concluyeron en
and in
aportes
Colombia
potenciales de
and
6.500 y 12.000
in
millones de
Peru,
dólares,
contributions
¿no?
could be
Respectivamente.
6.5
Depende
and
mucho de cuáles son los
$12
activos, ¿no?
billion
Que van
respectively.
incluyendo, ¿no?
Of
Como
course,
parte de este
the
portafolio
recycled
potencialmente
contributions would
reciclable.
depend on what would be the
Pero lo que vamos a
recycled
ver que es
assets.
bastante interesante, de
But
hecho,
one very
es
interesting
que
thing
hay
to look at
esquemas de uso de
is
reciclaje de
that
activos y valor residual
there
que también se
are
pueden usar
asset
para
recycling
países, ¿no? Que
schemes that
tienen
can
programas de
be
APP más recientes, ¿no?
used in
Mencionaba
countries with
Daniel, ¿no? Costa Rica, Ecuador,
younger
¿no? Que
PPP
también, ¿no? De hecho, podrían
programs
muy
like
bien
Costa
aplicar
Rica or
algunos
Ecuador,
de esos
who
esquemas,
could
¿no?
very
Entre
easily
otros países.
apply these schemes.
Algo importante también en el tema de reciclaje de activos es que en general
And
pensamos en temas carreteros, ¿no? Pensamos en
usually when one
transporte, ¿no?
thinks
Y
of
entonces tenemos que
assets, one tends
abrir
to think
mucho más el
on
abanico
in
de
highway
proyectos,
or
¿no? Que pueden
transportation, but
entrar
we
en ese
have
esquema.
to
A
open
mí
our
me gusta
mind
ese
and
ejemplo que
open
se hizo,
and be open to a
¿no?
wider
Me
array
¿no? A nivel
of
del municipio de Sao Paulo, Brasil,
projects.
para ir justamente viendo cuál era, ¿no? Los
We
activos
looked
que
at
se
the
podrían
experience of
entrar
Sao
en
Paulo
ese,
in
¿no?
Brazil
Programa de
to see
reciclaje de
what could
activos.
be
Y de hecho se
the
propusieron
project that could be
proyectos mucho
included
más
in an
variados,
asset
¿no? Desde
recycling
parques
project. So
urbanos,
we thought
tallos,
about
autobuses, ¿no?
parks
Terminales de
and
autobuses,
bus
¿no?
terminals,
Y hasta un
public
ensamble,
markets,
¿no? Entonces tenemos que
and
ir
even
viendo que al final hay
real
mucho
estate.
más
We
activos, ¿no? Que
and
pueden ir
and stadium.
reciclándose
So we realize that there are many,
varias
many assets
modalidades,
and can
¿no?
be
Diferentes.
recycled in different ways.
Entonces, la primera tarea, ¿no? A la cual nos abocamos es justamente intentar hacer como
So
sistematizar,
we
¿no? Los
need
esquemas de
to
reciclaje de activos, ¿no?
systemize
Que principalmente al principio la idea es sobre la base de
our asset
infraestructura
recycling
existente,
scheme.
¿no? Pero vamos a ver que podemos también usar
And
en particular el valor residual para apoyar, ¿no?
we
El
need
funding de
to
proyectos nuevos, ¿no?
use the scheme
Algo que
to
difiere
fund
también es
new
saber si el
projects.
proyecto ha
So one
sido
important thing
desarrollado
to
por
define
APP
is
originalmente
whether the
o por
project
obra pública
was
tradicional y si
originally
ha
a
sido
PPP
tarificado
or
o
was
no,
it
¿no?
traditional public work, and whether it paid a fee or a toll, and what will be the new funding scheme. Will the project will be funded through tolls and fees, or will it be funded from public funds? So by combining the different variables, we came up with 7 modalities. The first one is the classical asset. And the assets are existing assets that were developed under a traditional public works scheme. So that means that CAPEX has been paid for, but the asset has not paid any fee or toll. So these are projects that could pay a fee or a toll, because there are similar projects that pay fees or tolls. And here people will be willing to pay a fee if the service improves significantly. And in general, people don't want to pay for a service that remains the same. The expectation, if they pay something, will be that they will receive a better service. So this could have political consequences and social consequences if the fee is introduced. So case 2 differs from the case 1. It is an existing asset that was free and that was carried out as a traditional public work. And one can think of asset recycling scheme. Here, the payment will be deferred over time, and the payment, the fee will cover the maintenance costs and the operating costs. But the payment will be higher, and then the PPP will be launched, and funds will be taken to feed into the infrastructure fund. So the private management of the asset will cover maintenance, will improve the service, and will also improve the use of the asset. The additional funds will be used to finance other infrastructure. Then case 3 is similar to case 2, but the difference, but it is almost similar to a privatization. So these are assets that are sold out, and then there is a leaseback contract from the private sector to the public sector, so that the government can continue to use the asset, and then there is a buyback contract with the government. So the funds can be used to feed into the infrastructure project, but there is a risk that the asset could be privatized. This scheme has been used in Chile and in Spain. And model number 4, and then this is a rather classical scheme, and this is as well developed by traditional public work, and they are, but they have a fee, or they pay a toll, just like airports or theaters or the grid, more indirectly, if you will. Generally, the grid belongs to the government, but the users pay. The same happens with wastewater treatment plants. So all those assets
no dar en APP, no, a la gestión
are
privada, aprovechando de la mayor eficiencia del sector privado,
given to the private sector under a
a
PPP,
los usuarios una
but
tarifa mayor por el
users
servicio mejorado,
are
¿no?
not
Y que
pay,
parte de
are not
esos
the users are
ingresos, ¿no?
not
se
charged
vayan
for
monetizando
the
para
improved
usarles a
service,
otra,
but
¿no?
rather
infraestructura, ¿no? En particular, si se logra
the
mejorar bastante el servicio, ¿no?
the
Y
fees are when the
optimizar,
fees are
¿no?
charged,
Bastante la gestión del
but
activo,
and are used
¿no?
to manage the asset,
recursos
and
adicionales, ¿no?
they create additional funds.
El caso 5, que es el
Case
caso que
5
presenté anteriormente en las gráficas,
that
¿no?
I've
Que va
already
esquemas como
shown
más
to you
natural, ¿no? De
is a
reciclaje
more
de activo,
natural scheme.
es una concesión, una
So
PP, ¿no?
this
Que ya
is
llegó
a
al final de
concession
su
or
vida
a
útil y que se va
PPP that
a
has reached
reconcesionar,
the end of
¿no?
its
Entonces
useful
aquí se
life and
obtiene
will
un pago
be
por infraestructura
reconcessioned.
existente, ¿no? En la
So here
nueva
you receive
reconcesioón, ¿no? Basado en las tarifas
fee
actuales
for the
fluctuadas,
existing
y se va alimentando
infrastructure, and this fee
hay
is
ejemplos, ¿no? La ruta
feeds
5 en
into
Chile, por
the
ejemplo, que
fund.
ha aplicado eso, y vamos a
So
ver
Chile has
algunos
done
más ejemplos.
this, and we will look at other
El
examples
6, la modalidad
as
6
well.
es muy similar a la modalidad 5, pero es darse cuenta
And
que no
case
necesariamente
6 is
tengo
similar
que esperar
to
para
case 5, but
monetizar el
that
valor,
doesn't
¿no? que
necessarily
puede
mean that we
tener
have to
el
wait
activo y los
to
pagos futuros, ¿no? que pueden
monitor
obtener, ¿no? obtener de la
the
nueva reconstrucción, ¿no? No tengo que
the,
necesariamente esperar el
the
final de la
concession. So we don't
concesión, lo puedo
necessarily
hacer
need to
antes,
wait
¿no?
until the
Y
end
esa
of the
fue la
concession. We
idea
can
que fue
actually
atrás de la
do it
creación, ¿no?
before.
del Fondo de
And
Infraestructura en
this
Chile, que se
is
llama
what
Desarrollo
happened
País.
with
No
Desarrollo
obstante eso,
País
no
in
lo han
Chile, which is
aplicado, ¿no? de
an
manera
infrastructure fund,
masiva, más
but
bien
it has
al día
not
de hoy
been
lo que hacen es
massively
que
applied.
aplican
What
el
they
esquema de
do
reciclaje de
is
activos más
that they
proyecto por
apply
proyecto, ¿no?
the
Y ya
asset
finalmente esa
recycling on a
modalidad
project-by-project
7, que es un
basis.
poco
And finally,
diferente,
the
¿no?
case
Porque la idea principal de la modalidad 7 es
case
más captar
7
el valor
is
residual, ¿no? que puede tener el
about
activo, ¿no? Y entonces el hecho que sigan
capturing the
tarificando y
residual
sigan pagando
value
los
of
usuarios
the
futuros,
asset and to
¿no?
have the
Pero
users
que
continue
ese
paying
valor
for
se
the
vaya
asset.
captando para el mismo funding del proyecto que se quiere generar, ¿no? Entonces aquí estamos más en el
But this
mundo
is
de los APPs
for
mixtos, ¿no? Que
new
necesitan
projects.
un
So
aporte del
this is
gobierno,
a
pero
mixed
más que nada es
PPP
aporte
that
al
need a
principio,
contribution
¿no?
from the
Por
government, but the
ejemplo, con una
contributions
aportación
come at the beginning
irrecuperable, ¿no? Lo
with
que va a hacer
a
el gobierno es
sunken
que le va a
fund
decir al sector
contribution.
privado, yo
So
lo que voy
what
a
they
hacer es que
do
voy a hacer
is
un
that
pago al final,
they say,
¿no? del
well, we are
periodo,
going to pay at the
¿no?
end
Y
of
ese
a
pago al
project,
final del periodo lo
and
voy a ir
the payment
financiando
at
con los
the end of
ingresos
the
que voy a
project
obtener
will
de la
be
nueva concesión, ¿no?
financed with
Entonces aquí hay
the new
también
concession.
bastante, ¿no?
And
sectores y proyectos
this
que pueden
is
imaginar usar eso, ¿no?
a sector.
Aquí
Laura,
lo que
There are
ya
several
estamos
sectors that do
con el
this.
tiempo encima ya
So,
para finalizar
Laura,
con los panelistas,
we
por favor.
are
sí, me dan
with the
2
time on
minutos.
top. So two more minutes.
Un minuto, por favor.
1 minute,
Minuto.
1 minute.
Pero nada más para
So,
presentarle ese caso
just
de
to
Chile, que es
present
interesante
the
porque
case
es un
of
caso
Chile
real,
to
¿no?
you,
Donde
this is a case of
es una
Chile.
reconcesión no vial ¿no?
This
de una
is
autopista,
concession
donde lo que
of
están haciendo es
highway,
justamente combinando,
and
¿no?
they
A la
combine
vez un pago por infraestructura preexistente,
both
entonces
things. So they
obtienen, ¿no? la
combine
lógica de reciclaje de
infrastructure,
activos, ¿no?
so they are
Obtienen, ¿no?
recycling the
recursos,
asset,
¿no?
and
Para
they
eso. Y
obtain funds.
adicionalmente propusieron el esquema de valor residual. Entonces propusieron que haya un pago, ¿no? Al final del periodo de la nueva reconcesión, que se va a financiar a partir de la tercera, ¿no? reconcesión, ¿no?
And then this is financed through the third concession. So it's two concessions, and then the third concession is becomes self-financing. This scheme was very well accepted by the sector, and the project received up to 7 bids. So the market understood the concept very well, and the market is interested in the project, and this is how the new concessions are done for highways in Chile. So in ending, much could be said about the topic. We are looking at a scheme where it's case 7, but combining it with a lower present value of revenues, and that has its advantages, because in the end, payment will be a contingent liability and not only as a fixed payment. So there are several schemes. This is clearly a topic that we will continue to develop. In ending, I would want to say that I wish that you are willing to read our report. Thank you, Ana Laura, for your very interesting presentation. We will now move to the panel for the next half hour. 2 questions for each, and you have 5 minutes to answer.
I'm going to go over with my colleague from Brazil, Rafael Magalhães. Rafael, Brazil is one of the countries that has the biggest financial breast in the country, in the continent. In this regard, what actions have you taken forward for sustainable and successful financing?
Obrigado, Daniel, pela pergunta. Antes de passar a resposta,
Thank you for the question.
Tem bastante interesse no trabalho que foi apresentado. Acho que é desejo nosso. A gente tem buscado alternativas de solução para o financiamento da infraestrutura. E o fundo de infraestrutura, idealizado, como colocado aqui pela Ana Laura, tem uma relação muito forte com o desejo que nós temos de ter uma infraestrutura que possa ter a receita reciclada, ter um ativo reciclado para financiar os projetos. Então, já temos algumas iniciativas nesse sentido.
So there
certamente vai ser muito
are several initiatives, and we need this work will be very useful. And now, if I speak about the Brazilian experience,
diz respeito à utilização das debêntures de infraestrutura. Nós temos atualmente projeto que se iniciou há 10 anos atrás. Hoje ele ganha
experience is with a project that began 10 years ago.
Do financiamento da infraestrutura, que é a utilização de debêntures. Para se ter em mente,
and we are using debentures to finance infrastructure. The reference would be that debentures are responsible for, accounted for $1 billion in financing, and
chegou a marca de 10 bilhões de dólares. Então, nós saímos de 1 bilhão para 10 bilhões de dólares. Enquanto que o orçamento
this is, we went from 1 billion to 10 billion, and
ultrapassa pouco 1 bilhão e meio
for investments,
bem significativo, considerando a utilização das debêntures como alternativa de financiamento. Para que houvesse esse crescimento,
the idea is to use debentures as for funding.
Houve esforço do governo de criar programa de incentivos tributários,
and the government made a huge effort to create fiscal incentives
mercado de capitais,
that gave that allowed to develop an over-the-counter market or a capital market to raise funds and then to add those funds to financing infrastructure. So in addition to this funding scheme, we have added other projects like those that are using renewable energies. They are treated similarly, and they try to attract investors that make investments connected with that sort of projects. So there is an important concern about that. So this is why we look for certification, we look for a follow-up on infrastructure. This is what we are doing in the case of railways, so that our private partners can issue carbon bonds, for example. So this is a project that we're engaging in. We are looking into green bonds as well, and we are discussing a new project in Congress to update the debenture model, and we are issuing a new series or a new model of debentures, so to speak, seeking to reach institutional investors, just like asset managers or pension funds or private funds. there
prazo que há no
is a
financiamento
very
e a
close
expectativa de
relationship
recebíveis por parte desses
between
investidores.
the short term and the expectation to obtain gains by the investors.
Muchas gracias, Rafael.
Thank you very much, Rafael. Next, I will have Carlos Miriterán. Carlos, in Mexico, FONADIF has been characterized for supporting innovative financing strategies. In this regard, what challenges would you observe to continue with this work to favor, to benefit these socially inclusive projects? Yes, first I'd like to start by congratulating Ana Laura. Very interesting presentation, very encouraging. There are a series of alternatives to promote public-private partnership projects is employed. The case of Bonancin, I believe, is an interesting example where really the network of highways of quotas has been started to develop with private investment networks since the 90s. By then, we had about 1,200 kilometers of highways. So it was a drive to develop these highways with private funding. But it was bid based on who would accept the concession in the shortest possible term based on a fee and a traffic forecast. There was much interest. The banks all participated and the network grew. It went from 1,000 kilometers of highways to 7,000 kilometers in about 5 years. In the next period, we have experienced a financial crisis. Interest rates went through the roof. The economy went down. Measures were not complied, and all these private highways, which had been under concessions in segments, not in networks, they came in and to experience a financial crisis. Hence, the need to have rescate carretero, a rescue, a financial rescue, really a banking rescue, because these highways were funded more than 80% based on debt. And back then, many of the banks were state-owned, and they were later on privatized. So when the measures came down, the interest rates went through the roof, they were no longer viable financially. And the government stepped in for the financial rescue, and all of this network of highways became state-owned, and the government stepped in. They assumed the debt. They reformulated in the long term, at a longer term with lower interest rates, and that represents the wealth of the finance of the structure. These are long-term infrastructures, and ultimately everything pertaining to the payment of this debt, it has been covered via these rates. And so in 2008, we transformed this bailout in the infrastructure fund, which is funded by Banobras, the main development bank in Mexico, which is basically geared towards infrastructure and aimed at funding municipalities and states. So this infrastructure that is based on a network of highways, it's around 5,000 kilometers of highways right now in Mexico to date. And from this opening to private financing, there's more than 11,000 kilometers of highways, more than half under concession to this National Infrastructure Fund, operated by a decentralized body, which in its origin was a body that operated all of the highways based on tolls, which was about 1,200 kilometers. So now part of the operation is handled with this decentralized body, and there have been other models created as well for maintenance, rehabilitation, and operation of these highways that we call MRDO. So these are long-term, 7, 10, even 15-year contracts where the highways throughout the years, they require more and more maintenance and rehabilitation. In some cases, they need to expand the lanes. And so there is a contract. Sometimes it's construction, maintenance, rehabilitation, operation contract This is long-term with private entities, and their bid based on a payment for availability. This is covered with the revenue from the highway network. So they pay the maintenance body. It's really payment by availability. Another model that has been developed, having as a set of assets this network of highways, was precisely the sale of assets. So a series of highways, 2 or 3 highways are selected, high profitability ones, and they're put on bids for them to be acquired by a private entity. That was done at the beginning during the 80s. And with that sale, we managed to capture a set of assets that was also incorporated to the National Infrastructure Fund. So that fund had those funds that were collected from the sales of the series of assets, a sale of these assets, these highways, and with those resources, they have had enough resources, enough funds to fund other projects. So the network of highways has, as part of its mandate, 1, the conservation, maintenance, and expansion of the highways that are under their set of assets; 2, to pay the debt that the private side had with the bailout. And after covering all that, there was a surplus left over. And with this sum, they can fund making these go public, or perhaps gather more resources, and they can also support other projects. And basically, what it does is that it promotes public and private investment projects, whereas we are running out of time, Carlos. Well, as a conclusion, just to round out Ana Laura's suggestion, with this surplus, there was a series of financial instruments from the National Infrastructure Fund that are non-recoverable support, which can be up to 50% of the total investment, the other 50% with private investment. And in general, we've granted about 30% of total investment. So we covered 70% with private investment. We've supported probably 150 projects, most of them road projects, about 70% of them, but also mass transportation projects. We had a program for massive transportation projects, and we supported the state in the aspect of the infrastructure required by massive transportation projects, which are basically specialized infrastructure, exclusive lanes, and so on. And private investment is involved in everything pertaining to equipment and collection systems. We also created the Promagua program. We're out of time, Carlos. So we're supporting the states. We support them up to 50% of the total investment. The other 50% comes from private investment. So we have triggered a series of water projects as well. And we've created another program, which is for efficient waste management, where we also combine private investment with public investment. And we start developing projects that are combined basically not only with this financial support, but also technical support to improve the institutional capacity for planning and managing these projects, which is what ultimately makes them viable and sustainable in the long term. Thank you, Carlos. Thank you. Thank you very much. Federico, given the fact that at present all the countries of the region of Central America and Dominican Republic possess legislation for public-private partnership, what recommendation do you have for recycling of assets, given the limited experience with the use of such public services? Yes, thank you, Daniel. As mentioned in the question, we start with the fact that there is rather no tradition for consolidated payment for infrastructure, especially when it comes to transportation. When we think of roads, there are even countries of the region in Central America that do not have goal-based routes. But at the same time, I believe that the model for assets recycling is a tool for transition and transition in the following sense. The majority of the economies of our region, as well as those of many other parts of the world, depend almost exclusively on funds collected from taxes on fuel, both for the construction as well as for the maintenance of infrastructure, especially old infrastructure. What happens is that while we are at a special cross juncture because of the price of oil, this type of product will tend to erode throughout time with the incorporation of clean alternative energy. So the question is, why and how will we replace them? So the topic of asset recycling here poses an interesting alternative to start doing that match, or rather, by match, I mean going from tax collection, which is what sustains them, moving on to a system based on payment by use. And this type of payment could give some flexibility to administrations to adjust the rates, the fees, in a way that could be accepted by the users. That on the one hand. And other two interesting issues that we could highlight is that, as Rafael said, the issue of pension funds or AFPs, one of the elements that has made them farther and farther from infrastructure investment is one, the lack of projects in some cases, and in those where they have projects, their yield and the risk profile is not at the right phase. And we could perhaps look into interesting investments for these national savings, which are mostly being invested in public debt, which brings me to my last point, which is how do we guarantee, and that in fact we can expand on later on, in the case of the Costa Rican law that was specifically said, how to make sure that the funds collected from assets recycling be aimed at the development of infrastructures exclusively, or improvement of infrastructure, because in our current fiscal scenario, there's a tension that the funds collected via the recycling of assets be used for paying public debt or to address other needs. So I think that these are the important issues brought up by the importance of recycling of assets in our region. Thank you so very much, Federico. I go back to Rafael. I pose a following question for you, Rafael. Bearing in mind the stage of maturity of the PPP Brazil project, as well as the financial challenges that prevail in the post-COVID world, what lessons learned could you share to bring funding and financing instruments that would support developing sustainable PPP projects? Thank you.
Obrigado, Daniel, pela pergunta. Também quero fazer comentário rápido sobre a fala do Federico.
Thank you for the question. Just a brief comment regarding what Federico said. The main challenge, in fact, is to be able to use the resources from our concessions in order to keep them up, for them to be recycled and for them to be maintained within the infrastructure projects. And in that regard, I'd even like to respond to what Marco Siqueira said during the Q&A, when he helped by reminding me some initiatives that we have. Among them, it's to use resources from one concession or one project in order to support investment in another. We are not doing it through a special fund, which is what would be ideal for us, but we do it in different ways. One is through linked accounts allowed by our legislation for certain segments, and to have that fund, the resources from those projects, or even the concessionary, to be able to develop the works, or for them to be able to secure funds for other projects. This has been a good alternative, especially in the transportation sector, with very good results. And we also have the issue of part of the question related to COVID. It's evident that this is a moment of learning, particularly when it comes to comprehension of the resilience of projects. We need to structure projects then that can be copied. And I believe that one main issue that has to do with overcoming the stages of COVID or any situation that you find yourself in, challenges that have to do with the sustainability of the project, it starts with an initial phase, which would be structuring. There was a concern from Brazil in having structures that are capable of bringing the best practices from all the world. For that, we only have Brazil's Development Bank. We also have IDB and a public logistical planning enterprise that we are turning into a broader organization, which is called Infra-SA, and we are learning and incorporating the best global practices in terms of structuring our projects, mainly a situation where Brazil has a large pipeline of projects to deliver. The main concern is to have well carried out dialogue with the market, and also to have a structure with associates, with partners, institutional partners. And within this rationale, we've also incorporated some practices that we understand are favorable for the market. For example, the three-party agreement that could even bring mechanisms for financing entities, and could also help with collecting resources and for finders, and also arbitration for resolution of the litigation, mainly with a risk matrix that be appropriate and adequate for the project, knowing the risks of the market, knowing the risks that the market sees in Brazil, and adapting to the needs based on each situation. One example would be exchange risk, or using the linked account that we only use for this type of investments for projects. We can also use the infrastructure fund or an account linked to the project in order to create a pool of resources that can respond to the project's needs when the need arises, to use these funds for any sort of associated risks. For example, exchange risk. There was also an innovation within our legal framework, which allowed exporters to sign contracts in dollars in Brazil, so that these concessionaires that they sign contracts with, so that they could have a natural hedge if they wanted to have financing in a foreign currency. And to conclude, the other important point has to do with the speed, the need of having an immediate response regarding the situation. So specifically, when it comes to COVID, we had a broad agreement, a significant pact, significantly or mainly with the aviation sector, and the Ministry of Infrastructure, along with the government, they have positioned themselves identifying an extraordinary situation, and also categorizing COVID as an extraordinary cause, allowing to adapt the contracts, which was beneficial for the market and was a positive response. That is something I'd like to share. And of course, it is always learning for us going through these scenarios, but also it's the possibility of having debates with the team. Thank you very much, Rafael. Carlos? In an environment where access to public funds has become a true challenge, what sectorial opportunities could you identify in FONAVIN in Mexico to promote new funding and financing alternatives?
Bien, muchas gracias.
Yes, thank you very much.
Por un lado, en la parte
Where on the
sectorial,
one hand,
quizás no hablando de
when it
Fonavin,
comes to the
la parte de los
sectorial
puertos
aspect, if you will,
es un
perhaps not talking
elemento
about
fundamental.
Fonadin, the part
Evolucionó
pertaining to
de
ports,
estar
which is a
totalmente
fundamental element,
centralizado
it evolved
a
from being
crear los
totally
conceptos de las
centralized.
derechos portuarios integrales.
Here we
Entonces, todos los
had the
ingresos de los derechos portuarios que antes iban a los
concepts where
puertos
all
se quedan
the
en los puertos.
rights,
Eso
all
le ha
the
dado una
all the
viabilidad
collection
financiera a cada uno de los
remained in the
puertos.
ports, which has given
Y entonces los
viability, financial
puertos, a su
viability
vez,
to each of
han
the ports. And
fomentado
each of the
inversión
ports in
privada
turn
dentro de
have
los puertos, dando sesiones
fostered
parciales de derechos
private
de
investment within the
concesiones
port.
integrales del puerto. Eso es un
That is
esquema que
one
está
scheme
creciendo y ahorita
that is
prácticamente casi
growing,
todos los
and
puertos
almost all
resultan
ports
financiables.
are
Luego, en la parte
able to be financed
de
this way. Now, when it
carreteras,
comes to
pues
roads,
todo el esquema de acción pública
well,
privada
all of
se
the
está
public-private
impulsando
action
primero
scheme,
todo lo que
it's
es carreteras de costa,
promoting
pero además ahorita
not only
también
fee
libramientos y
portfolios, but
autopistas
also
urbanas.
urban
Y es tal la
highways.
cantidad de
And
automóviles y demás que hacen viable
it's such the
financieramente
amount
todas las
of
autopistas y
vehicles that
autopistas.
it makes it
Entonces,
viable to have
en
these
cuanto a fomentar infraestructura para los
highways,
automóviles y para el transporte
this
carretero,
expansion. So
está
promoting
funcionando
this
bien y es
is working
estratégico.
well. It's
Sin embargo,
strategic.
hay un
However,
desequilibrio en
there's an
cuanto a impulsar el
imbalance
transporte
when it
masivo
comes to a
y en
promotion of
cuanto
mass
a impulsar el
transportation
transporte
and
ferroviario. Entonces, ahorita
railroad
la parte
transportation.
para
So
impulsar el
right
transporte
now,
ferroviario,
in order to
pues se tiene que hacer
promote,
una combinación
develop
entre recursos
railroad
públicos
transportation, there needs
federales
to be a
con
combination
algo de
with
apoyo
the
del
public
Fonavit
federal sources
y
with
sobre
some
todo
support from
financiamientos
FONADIN,
con
and
tasas de
especially
interés y a
funding
largo
with
plazo, sobre todo
that are
para proyectos de
long-term and
tipo
with good interest
ferroviario o
rates
de metro
for
y
this
demás
type of
que requieren créditos
metro systems or railroad
amortizables.
projects that require
Entonces, en el
credit
caso de
at a
Fonavit
much
tenemos la
longer
ventaja de
term.
tener
So
una
in
sinergia
FONAVID, we have the
con el
advantage of
propio
having a
Banco Nacional de
synergy
Obras y
with the
Servicios
bank,
Públicos.
the
Entonces,
National Bank
combinamos
of
también
Works and
créditos a
Public
largo
Services
plazo
itself. So
de
we
Banobras
combine
con apoyos no
long-term
recuperables
schemes with
de Fonavit
non-recoverable
para
support
financiar la
from
infraestructura,
FONADIN to fund
dado que no es
the
posible
infrastructure,
vía
given the
tarifa
fact that it is
recuperar
not
costo de operación
possible
y mantenimiento y además
via a
financiar
collection
la
of
infraestructura.
fees to
Entonces
recover the
es
cost
una beta
and
que se está haciendo.
also
Otro que se está
fund the
haciendo es
infrastructure. So this is something
desdoblamiento
else
de
we're doing,
concesiones.
which is
Están
to
llegando
double
al
the
término
concessions.
las concesiones, entonces están
Concessions
haciendo
are
un
reaching their
desdoblamiento de
termination, so
concesiones
we
con el
are
compromiso de ampliar la
having
autopista
getting the
a
commitment to
otra,
expand
con ramales o
highways
incluso autopistas, no
with
necesariamente toda ella,
so with
pero que con
branches.
este desdoblamiento se les impone
But with
como
this
cargas
approach, they're
constructivas
impose
a la
constructive
concesión,
fees to the
que lo hacen
concession,
ampliando el plazo
which
de la
is done
concesión.
by
Y
expanding
entonces
the term
de
of
esa
the
manera
concession. And
estamos,
so that
y esto
way,
se está usando bastante, entonces varias nuevos
and this is
proyectos de
being
autopistas
used
que no
widely.
son
There are
viables
several
financieramente por
highway
sí,
projects that are not
pero
viable,
combinados con
financially
las
viable
obras, con las
by
concesiones que
themselves, but
son como
combined with
brownfield
the concessions
ya en
that we
operación
had,
y que
such as
quedan muy
brownfield,
recuperables, incluso ya recuperadas,
they've
se
even
les
generated a
mete
surplus, they've even
otra
recovered it,
carga y
and
se
we
están ampliando las
get
concesiones. Incluso el
another
propio Fonavit
fee, and we're
se le han
expanding the
ampliado su
concessions.
plazo de
Infonavin
concesión
has
y le ha
expanded its
permitido incluso
concession term, and it
capitalizar
has allowed them
ingresos y tener más
even to
recursos para financiar más
getting
proyectos
the resources
bajo
into
el
the
esquema
stock and
esta
fund more
de
projects under this
participar
scheme where
parcialmente nada más
they partially
con la inversión
participate in both,
inducir, pues al menos
and
la meta
to
es invertir
induce,
por
well, the
cada peso
goal is at
invertido,
least for every
inducir 2
invested
pesos de
peso
inversión
to
privada, ya sea de
bring
capital de
2
riesgo o de
pesos
créditos
from
haciendo bancables los
private
proyectos.
sources,
Muchas gracias,
be it from
Carlos. Estamos
capital.
ya en tiempo.
Thank you very much, Carlo. We're out of
Agradezco mucho,
time.
tu respuesta.
And I thank
Finalmente,
you for
Federico,
your answer.
por favor,
Finally,
responder.
Federico, please.
Disculpa, tenemos muy apretado
And I'm sorry, I apologize. We are very tight on time. We're a bit over time. If you could answer the following question in 2 or 3 minutes, please. In Costa Rica, in 2019, there was a reform approved to concessions to incorporate the instrument of assets recycling. What has been the progress so far, and what's the potential?
Bueno, ese es un
Yes,
elemento muy importante en
this was a very
2019,
important element in
porque ya se venía
2019
planteando, sobre
because
todo dentro de
it
la
had already
discusión
been mentioned, especially
de la negociación que estaba teniendo Costa
in
Rica con
the
el Fondo
negotiation that
Monetario
Costa Rica had
Internacional,
with the
pues
International
para plantear
International
esquemas
Monetary
alternativos
Fund
para el
to
fondeo de proyectos de
propose
infraestructura
alternative schemes for projects for infrastructure funding. So it was made explicit. There was a gap in the law in that regard, especially when it comes to incorporating fees that would cover payments made by a concessionary upfront. We were not able to incorporate it through fees in the past because it was not considered a CAPEX element. That was solved. And now what has been the progress? We've already identified some potential actors where we can implement this recycling scheme, even some that have been financed by the IDB itself in recent years, which already have a problem in the sense that there is no formally established maintenance program for them, and they've been recently developed. And so we have made progress in that regard. And I'll close with the following very relevant point. I mentioned it earlier. There is that risk of resources not going to infrastructure projects, but being aimed at payment of debt, covering the payment of debt. The law prevents that. The law states that it says clearly that they need to be invested in infrastructure, reinvested in infrastructure. Now, close with this, I believe a positive project. The fact that you can incorporate assets recycling to launch to international markets, and that's just that. I'm assuming there's the risk for the development of new projects, but at the same time, these projects will enter into a revolving scheme that will allow me to manage it properly and have fresh resources for other initiatives. So I'll leave you with that, and I hope that we are talking about completed projects next time we meet. Thank you very much, Federico, and I thank Ana Laura and these four panelists, top-notch panelists. And this brings us to the end of our session, and we're beginning the next panel. Thank you so very much.
Hasta luego.